January 2010, Plant City, Florida. Investigators are standing behind a rural property, staring at a slab of concrete. It's a grave. At least, that's what they believe. For months, a man named Abraham Shakespeare has been missing. Not just any man, a lottery millionaire. 3 years earlier, Abraham had been a working-class man in Lakeland, Florida. He did odd jobs. He did what he had to do to get by. Then one day, he bought a lottery ticket and won $30 million. For most people, that sounds like the dream. For Abraham, it became the beginning of something much darker. After the money came the lawsuits, the strangers, the friends who needed help, people asking for mortgages, cars, loans, favors, and second chances. Somewhere along the way, Abraham met a businesswoman named Dee Dee Moore. She said she wanted to help. She said she wanted to tell his story, try to get his finances in order. Abraham was burning through his winnings, and so many people owed him money. And then Abraham suddenly vanished. Dee Dee told people that Abraham was tired of everyone asking him for money. Some believed that he'd moved away, having had enough of the constant money requests and people taking advantage of him. Others weren't so sure. Meanwhile, text messages were still coming from Abraham's phone. Relatives and investigators were told that he was still alive. But as the months passed, no one seemed able to find Abraham. His family knew something was wrong. Now investigators are digging beneath the concrete. And underneath that slab in Plant City, Florida, the truth is waiting. Welcome to the Southern Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Swift, and as always, we're exploring the people, places, history, mysteries, folklore, and true crime stories that make the South such a fascinating place. Today, we're heading to Florida. In 2006, a working-class man named Abraham Shakespeare bought a lottery ticket and won $30 million. Overnight, he went from struggling to get by to becoming one of the most talked about men in the state. But as we'll see, winning the lottery doesn't solve all of Abraham's problems. In many ways, it created entirely new ones. Over the next few years, there would be lawsuits, questions, conflicting stories, and eventually a mystery that would capture headlines across the country. This is the story of Abraham Shakespeare. Before we jump in, if you're enjoying the shows, please take a moment to make sure you are subscribed to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening to your podcast. The ratings and reviews that you leave really help people or more people discover the podcast. It makes a huge difference, so I appreciate you guys doing that. And if you want to support the show even further, consider joining our Patreon. It's called the Hidden Pond Lodge. It's part of the Southern Blueprints community. Members get access to exclusive content, bonus discussions, And you also get access to our private Discord community. And Discord is like an online chat thing. It's kind of like Slack or Microsoft Teams. And there's different channels for different discussions. We have some for, bourbon, cigars, hiking, fly fishing, camping, gardening. That's also where we have our book club and also our bird club. It's only $4 a month. Like I said, it really helps the show out and also just gets you access and to talk to other people that like similar things. I'll put the link in the show notes, but now let's head back to Florida. Before Abraham became a headline, before television cameras showed up in Lakeland, before lawyers, investigators, and reporters started saying his name on the evening news, he was just another working man trying to get by in Central Florida. Abraham was born on April 24th, 1966, and spent most of his life in and around Lakeland, a city located between Tampa and Orlando. By the time he became famous, Abraham was in his 40s and spent most of his life doing whatever work he could find. Friends and family described him as a laborer, a man who wasn't afraid of hard work and wasn't above taking odd jobs when necessary. One day he might be helping unload trucks. Another day he might be sweeping floors at a local barbershop. He wasn't building a fortune. He was, like most people, just trying to survive. What makes Abraham interesting is that almost every person who knew him seemed to describe him in remarkably similar terms. They didn't talk about him as being ambitious. They didn't describe him as being flashy. They didn't portray him as someone obsessed with money. Instead, people repeatedly used words like generous, friendly, trusting, and kind. When Abraham had something, he shared it. When somebody needed help, he often tried to help. People who knew Abraham said he genuinely enjoyed helping others. Unfortunately, one of the recurring themes in this story is that generosity can sometimes attract the wrong people. Abraham was not a financial expert. He wasn't surrounded by attorneys, wealth managers, and investment advisors. He was just a regular guy from Lakeland who suddenly found himself responsible for more money than most people see in multiple lifetimes. And that's an important distinction because many lottery winners they just start spending recklessly, right? They buy all these things, but Abraham's story begins somewhere else. It begins with people. The people who appeared after the money arrived. The people who wanted help. The people who wanted access. The people who wanted a piece of what he had. On November 15th, 2006, Abraham and a co-worker named Michael Ford stopped at a convenience store in Frostproof, Florida. It was the kind of stop that happens every day across America. A quick stop for snacks, drinks, cigarettes, whatever. And in this case, go in and buy a lottery ticket. This happens all the time. Neither man could have known that within a few hours, one of those tickets would be worth $30 million. Almost overnight, Abraham went from a man struggling to get by to one of the newest millionaires in the state of Florida. For most people, winning the lottery exists entirely in the realm of fantasy. People talk about it at work. They daydream about, what they're going to buy on their commutes to work. If I won the lottery, I would do this and that. They would imagine the house that they would buy, the vacations that they would take, the debts that they would pay off, and the life that they would build if money were no longer a concern. The Florida lottery offered Abraham a choice. He could receive the winnings through annual payments spread out over time, or he could take a lump sum payout, like many winners, Abraham chose the lump sum. After taxes and reductions, the payout came to approximately $17 million. Reporters descended on Lakeland. Television stations wanted interviews. Newspapers wanted photographs. People wanted to know what Abraham planned to do with the money. And at first, he appeared grateful and excited, much like anyone would be when they win that amount of money. But while the public saw a feel-good story, the reality was already beginning to change behind the scenes. One of the first signs that trouble was coming arrived almost immediately. The same coworker who had been with Abraham when the winning ticket was purchased suddenly claimed that the ticket belonged to him. Michael Ford filed a lawsuit arguing that Abraham had somehow stolen the winning ticket. For nearly a year, the dispute hung over Abraham Shakespeare. The lawsuit became one of the first major tests of his new life as a millionaire. And eventually, the case went before a jury. Ford argued that the ticket had been his. Abraham, of course, maintained that he had provided the money and that the winnings belonged to him. After hearing the evidence, the jury sided with Abraham. The lawsuit failed. Legally, the matter was settled. But the episode revealed something Abraham would encounter again and again over the next few years. The money had changed how people saw him. Before the lottery, Abraham was simply Abraham. After the lottery, he became an opportunity, a solution, and even a target. As word spread about his winnings, people began showing up with requests. Some were family, some were friends, some were acquaintances, some were people he barely knew. Abraham was getting so many requests. He was loaning all this money out, or actually owning the cars and the houses that he was helping people out with. He was actually kind of like a landlord. He was helping people with mortgages. He was buying this and buying that. Like I said, he was like a landlord in many cases, or it was like the Bank of Abraham. People were having to pay Abraham monthly on loans or rent, or etc. The issue was a lot of these people weren't actually paying Abraham back. They were just taking, and friends and family were taking advantage of him. But he kept loaning this out because that's just how he is. He was helping about everyone who was asking. While Abraham Shakespeare was adjusting to life as a lottery winner, another story was unfolding elsewhere in Central Florida. Unlike Abraham, Dee Dee Moore was not someone who suddenly found herself with money. She presented herself as someone who knew how to make it. By the time she entered Abraham's story, Dee Dee had built a reputation as a businesswoman. She owned a company called American Medical Professionals, a healthcare staffing agency that supplied nurses and other medical personnel to hospitals and healthcare facilities. On the surface, she looked successful. She was articulate, confident, and comfortable in professional settings. She knew how to talk to people. She knew how to present herself. More importantly, she understood how to gain someone's trust. To people meeting her for the first time, Dee Dee often came across as capable and resourceful. She seemed like someone who could solve problems, someone who knew how to navigate complicated situations, someone who had connections, ideas, and answers. But if you look beyond that image, there were signs that things weren't always as they appeared. Years before she ever met Abraham Shakespeare, Dee Dee had already found herself in serious legal trouble. In 2001, authorities accused her of orchestrating an elaborate insurance fraud scheme involving a vehicle that was in danger of being repossessed. According to investigators, Dee Dee reported that she had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and carjacked. It was a dramatic story, one that immediately attracted the attention of law enforcement. But as the investigators dug deeper, they concluded that the incident had never even happened. Instead, prosecutors alleged that the vehicle had been hidden and that the entire story had been fabricated as part of an effort to avoid repossession and collect insurance money on it. The case eventually resulted in convictions related to insurance fraud and falsely reporting a crime. Dee Dee was sentenced to 1 year of probation, which seems kind of light. Anyways, financial troubles would also surface as well. Public records show that Dee Dee filed for bankruptcy in 2002. Again, that fact isn't, remarkable by itself. Thousands of Americans file for bankruptcy every year. Business struggle, debt accumulates, circumstances change. Still, it presented an interesting contrast. On one hand, Dee Dee projected the image of a successful entrepreneur. On the other, public records show periods of significant financial pressure. It was a pattern that would appear repeatedly throughout her life. The public image often looked cleaner and more polished than the reality actually behind it. As the years passed, American medical professionals continued operating, and Dee Dee became increasingly involved in the business community. She appeared comfortable networking, building relationships, and positioning herself alongside people who had money, influence, or opportunities. People who encountered her often described Dee Dee as someone who had a way of inserting herself into situations and quickly becoming part of the conversation. Dee Dee often seemed to know everyone's business, everyone's problems, and everyone's opportunities. By 2008, Dee Dee was living in Central Florida, operating her business. At the same time, Abraham was trying to navigate a world he had never expected to enter. He had money, but he was also dealing with constant requests, unwanted attention, and the pressures that came with becoming one of Florida's most recognizable lottery winners. On paper, these two had very little in common. One was a working-class laborer who had stumbled into extraordinary wealth. The other was a businesswoman who projected confidence, professionalism, and ambition. There was no obvious reason their paths should ever cross. And yet, sometime in 2008, they did. According to later accounts, the introduction came through Abraham's realtor. At the time, Abraham had used a portion of his lottery winnings to buy a $1 million mansion in a gated community in Lakeland. It's a house he always wanted to buy. Now, how the realtor and Dee Dee knew each other is not entirely clear. But again, Dee Dee was a good networker, someone who was in the know. The realtor tells Dee Dee all about Abraham and his story. And Dee Dee was like, I have to meet this guy. It's amazing. It's a great story. She didn't want to meet him because, she wanted a loan, not because she wanted to invest in a business venture, at least not initially. Instead, she wanted to approach Abraham with an idea. Abraham Shakespeare's life, she believed, would make a fascinating book. A working man from Lakeland wins $30 million and discovers that sudden wealth comes with its own set of challenges. It was a compelling premise. And for Abraham, it may have sounded like a harmless one. After all, by that point, he had spent years dealing with people who wanted something from him. Compared to lawsuits, loan requests, and constant appeals for money, a conversation about writing a book probably seemed relatively innocent. As their relationship grew, Abraham seemed increasingly comfortable allowing Dee Dee into parts of his life that most people never saw. And with every conversation, every meeting, and every problem she helped solve, Dee Dee learned a little more about Abraham Shakespeare. Dee Dee positioned herself as someone who could help bring order to all the chaos. According to later testimony and court records, she began assisting Abraham in collecting debts and handling various financial matters. People who wanted to do business with Abraham often found themselves now speaking with Dee Dee. People who owed Abraham money sometimes found themselves dealing with Dee Dee. In some cases, she became kind of like an intermediary between Abraham and the outside world. For someone who was exhausted by constant demands for money, that arrangement may have felt sort of like relief. For the first time in years, someone seemed willing to help shoulder the burden. As Dee Dee's role expanded, so did her access. She learned more about Abraham's finances, more about his assets, more about the people around him, more about his frustrations, and perhaps more importantly, more about how isolated he had become. During this period, a number of financial transactions and business arrangements began taking shape. Companies were created. Property started changing hands. Accounts were open. Documents were signed. And Abraham was basically illiterate. Some of those actions, I guess, appeared routine at the time. Wealthy people buy property. Wealthy people buy companies or form companies. Wealthy people move money between accounts and everything like that. And again, Dee Dee was trying to help Abraham supposedly get his finances in order and start recouping some of the money that he'd loaned out. And this is where the story begins to take on a different shape. Until now, Abraham's lottery problems had mostly looked like the problems of a generous man surrounded by people asking for help. Friends needed loans. Family needed favors. Strangers came with sob stories. But now the money was moving through companies, property transfers, and there were different accounts being opened. Dee Dee knew who owed Abraham money. She knew what frustrated him. She had even videotaped him saying all this in his own words, saying how frustrated he was with the whole situation and everybody taking advantage of him. She also knew how much Abraham still had. Now, he had burned through most of his winnings by then. He really just only had a small fraction of what he initially won. And Dee Dee, well, she knew the people in his life, the ones he trusted, the ones he resented, and the ones who kept showing up with their hands out. Dee Dee wanted to claw back some of the money that he'd loaned out, some of the property and everything else. So, there was Dee Dee Moore, who had inserted herself in this whole situation. At some point during the spring of 2009, Abraham Shakespeare was seen for the last time. Like many details in the case, exactly when and where that final sighting occurred would become a matter of debate. What is clear is that by April 2009, Shakespeare was still alive and still moving through his daily routine. then he wasn't. One of the reasons this case became so difficult to unravel is that Abraham did not vanish in a dramatic fashion. There was no crime scene, no abandoned vehicle, no sign of a struggle, no frantic search parties combing through the woods and fields. For a while, there was simply an absence. People stopped seeing him. At first, that wasn't necessarily unusual. Abraham had means to travel, and after becoming a millionaire, his life no longer followed the same routines, like it once had. Days could pass now without friends and family seeing him. That alone wasn't enough to raise alarm bells, but as the weeks continued and the lack of contact became harder to explain, people who normally spoke to Abraham, they couldn't seem to reach him. Family members began asking questions. And when they did, many of those questions seemed to lead back to the same person, Dee Dee Moore. By this point, Dee Dee had become one of the people closest to Abraham, right? She was helping him with his finances. She was reaching out to people to collect money. She was involved in his business affairs, knew many of the people in his life, and often acted as that, like we keep saying, that go-between when others needed information. If someone wanted to know where Abraham was, Dee Dee often had an answer. According to later testimony and reporting, Dee Dee told people that Abraham was fine. He was simply gone for a while. He needed a break. He wanted some time away. Depending on who was asking, the details varied. Some people were told he was in Texas. Others heard he was just traveling. Still others were told he had gone away because he was tired of all the pressure that had followed him since winning the lottery. And there were still text messages coming from Abraham's phone. Like everyone else, Abraham's mom was concerned, and she was hearing nothing but explanations. She was being told that Abraham was okay, but weeks had turned into months now, and those reassurances were beginning to wear thin. Abraham always talked to his mom. There's a difference between being told your son is alive and hearing your son's own voice. There's a difference between receiving secondhand information and speaking directly to someone you love, speaking to your son. Something wasn't right, she felt. And so in November 2009, Abraham was officially reported missing. What had once been a private mystery among friends and family became a law enforcement investigation. Detectives began reviewing timelines, interviewing witnesses, examining financial records, and trying to determine where Abraham had gone. The deeper they dug, the stranger the case became, because investigators were not simply looking for a missing man. They were trying to untangle a web of explanations, messages, and communications that appeared to have been carefully constructed to convince people that Abraham Shakespeare was still alive. And before long, that investigation would lead detectives to a man named Gregory Smith, whose involvement in the case would become one of the first major breakthroughs. For the first time since Abraham's disappearance, investigators found themselves pulling on a thread. And that thread was about to unravel everything. As detectives worked through leads, one particular incident attracted their attention, and it involved Abraham's mother, Elizabeth Walker. Like everyone else, Abraham's mom had spent months being told that her son was alive. She had heard all the explanations. But hearing your child is fine and knowing that your child is fine is two very different things. But then a phone call came. The caller claimed to be her son Abraham. For a mother who had not spoken to her son in months, it should have been a tremendous relief. Instead, it raised even more questions. According to later testimony, Abraham's mother immediately felt something was wrong. The voice on the other end did not sound like her son. The caller had said, I'm not feeling really well, but it's me. But the conversation did not feel right. Rather than easing her concerns, the phone call deepened them. It was one of those moments that would later take on enormous significance. At the time, however, nobody knew exactly where the call had come from or who had placed it. Detectives decided to find out. As investigators traced the call, they were led to a man named Gregory Smith. Now, Gregory Smith was not a family member. He was not a longtime friend of Abraham, but he did know Abraham. When investigators questioned him, they began uncovering information that changed the direction of the investigation. According to Gregory Smith, he had been asked to make the call. The more detectives learned, the more interested they became. Why would someone ask another person to call a missing man's mother and pretend to be her son? What purpose did that serve? And perhaps more importantly, who had arranged it? Detectives began comparing what Smith told them with information they had gathered from other sources. And before long, Gregory Smith would agree to help investigators in a way that few people could have anticipated. What happened next would produce some of the most important evidence in the entire case. What detectives discovered about Gregory Smith helped explain why he had been chosen in the first place. Smith wasn't some random acquaintance who happened to get pulled into the investigation. He had known Abraham. He'd known him for a little while. In fact, Gregory Smith operated a barbershop in Lakeland where Abraham occasionally worked. The two men were, you could call them friends, at least acquaintances. So, and like many people in Abraham's life after the lottery win, Gregory Smith had benefited from Abraham's generosity. After Abraham became a millionaire, he loaned Gregory Smith tens of thousands of dollars. Reports vary on the exact amount, but the testimony and reporting placed the debt anywhere between $60,000 and $85,000. That debt would eventually make Gregory Smith useful to Dee Dee Moore. According to Smith's later testimony, Dee Dee approached him after Abraham disappeared and proposed a deal. If he would help convince people that Abraham was still alive, she would forgive the money he owed. Again, Dee Dee had positioned herself in a way that she was now legally in charge of Abraham's finances and could legally recoup money, evict folks, and reclaim property. And for Gregory Smith, it was a tempting offer. And for Dee Dee, it solved a problem. Friends wanted answers. Detectives wanted answers. The longer Abraham remained missing, the harder it became to maintain the story that he had simply left town. Dee Dee needed people who could help make Abraham at least appear alive. Gregory Smith became one of those people. So, Dee Dee paid Smith to call Abraham's mother, Elizabeth Walker, and pretend to be Abraham. As investigators kept talking to Smith, they quickly realized the situation was far more serious than they had believed. Whatever Dee Dee had told investigators, detectives were now treating Abraham's disappearance as a major criminal investigation, rather than continue protecting Dee Dee, Gregory Smith agreed to cooperate. Smith became a confidential informant for the sheriff's office. Working with investigators, he continued communicating with Dee Dee while secretly recording their conversations. One of the more memorable details of the investigation involved a modified Red Bull can. Investigators concealed recording equipment inside the can, allowing Gregory Smith to capture conversations without attracting attention. Sounds like something out of a movie, but it became one of the most important tools in the case. As the recordings accumulated, investigators gained a clear picture of what Dee Dee had been doing behind the scenes. Gregory Smith also told authorities that Dee Dee had discussed finding someone willing to take responsibility for Abraham's death. Smith believed she was actively searching for a fall guy, someone who could confess to the crime and divert attention away from herself. And that development gave law enforcement an opportunity. Working with Smith, investigators introduced Dee Dee to an undercover officer. The officer posed as someone who might be willing to claim responsibility for Abraham's murder in exchange for money. Someone who was already prison-bound on other charges. Someone with nothing to lose. The money would be for the fall guy's family and children. The plan worked. Believing she was speaking with a potential partner in crime, Dee Dee agreed to pay $50,000. But the undercover officer had a condition. Before he would agree to anything, he needed proof. He needed details so it would make things look legit. He would have details that only the killer would know. He needed to know where Abraham Shakespeare was buried. And that request forced the conversation into territory Dee Dee had spent months avoiding. The undercover operation, combined with Gregory Smith's recordings, pushed investigators closer than they ever had been to finding Abraham. For months, the case had been filled with rumors, fake phone calls, text messages, contradictory stories, and dead ends. Now investigators had something different. They had recorded conversations. They had a cooperating witness. They had an undercover officer. And more importantly now, they got the specific location of where Abraham was. Law enforcement now had everything that they needed. And on January 26, 2010, they arrested Dee Dee Moore. 2 days later, a forensics team dug 9 feet down beneath a freshly poured concrete slab on the property owned by Dee Dee and right where she said it would be. And they exhumed Abraham's body. Walmart surveillance footage later surfaced showing Dee Dee purchasing duct tape, gloves, and plastic sheeting used in the burial. At her trial, Gregory Smith took the stand as the state's star witness, and jurors listened to hours and hours of undercover recordings. In the tapes, Dee Dee explicitly walks Gregory Smith through a diagram of how to dig up Abraham's mummified corpse under the concrete slab, instructing him to pour kerosene in a cattle trough to burn the body. In a disturbing moment on the tape, she joked that Gregory Smith should bring marshmallows, as I guess he's burning the body. The prosecution called the undercover Lake Wells officer who posed as a prison-bound drug dealer, I guess, the fall guy. And he testified that Moore had offered him $50,000 to take the fall for the murder. On the recording, Dee Dee manipulates him by saying, "You're going to be a legend. You're going to be in a book and probably on the Oprah show." Dee Dee's a piece of work, by the way. I'll add more to this on my Patreon, and that goes a little bit more into her background. But I've got to say, she is a huge piece of work. We'll continue the story, and there'll be more about her. But like I said, I'll add a little more about this on my Patreon. The prosecution also played that Walmart surveillance footage of Dee Dee making, it was like $104 cash purchase for the gloves and the duct tape and the plastic sheeting. And these exact items were recovered by forensics next to Shakespeare's body. And I want to go back. I guess Dee Dee was trying to tell Gregory Smith and then the undercover agent where this body was to get him out from this ground and burn the body to like really try to get rid of the evidence and get it off her property. So if you were a little confused about that, that's kind of the idea behind it, is like Dee Dee was trying her best to wring her hands of it, so she needed him dug up and off her property that she owned, and I guess burn the body and everything like that. The state also proved that Dee Dee forged a 2-page letter to Abraham's mother at a Comfort Inn and Suites. They emphasized the absurdity of the ruse, given that Shakespeare was, as I mentioned already, he was basically entirely illiterate. I mean, he was smart in his own right, just as far as reading and writing, he was pretty much illiterate. So the fact that he wrote a 2-page letter to his mother was definitely another red flag, and they were able to show that. And I guess the letter was on Comfort Inn and Suites stationery to make it seem like, again, that he was traveling out of town, trying to stay away from everybody. And there were other witnesses who took the stand, revealing the lengths to which Dee Dee went to manipulate the people around her. There was the ex-husband, Dee Dee's ex-husband, James Moore, who testified that she had him buy a backhoe with her own money and use it to dig a hole, to dig a deep hole in the backyard of her that Plant City property. He said that she told him that it was to just bury construction debris and trash from the remodel. He stated he had no idea it was being dug for a body. Once the digging was completed, he left the property. A few hours later, after he left, Dee Dee called him back to the property frantically, telling him she needed him to fill the hole back in immediately. When James arrived, it was dark. He testified that there was no one else on the property except for Dee Dee, who was completely covered in sweat, like she had been working heavily. James used the backhoe to push the dirt back into the hole, burying whatever was inside. Because it was dark and he trusted her excuse about the remodeling trash, he testified he never saw Abraham Shakespeare's body hidden at the bottom of the pit. Then you have the hired hand. Days after the hole was filled, Dee Dee wanted to permanently seal the grave to prevent the smell of decomposition from escaping and to hide the disturbed earth. So she hired a local laborer named Gennaro Rodriguez. She gave him a cover story claiming she wanted a concrete pad poured in the exact spot in the backyard so she could park a boat. Rodriguez testified that at trial that he was completely unaware of the murder and simply poured the concrete slab directly over the freshly filled hole as like a standard paid job. Then there was a a lady named Judy Butler, who testified that Dee Dee offered her a car and a house to mislead detectives by claiming Abraham had run off with a lady from the bank. In a bizarre retaliation, Dee Dee forced her lawyers to play a video of Judy Butler claiming Abraham had given her AIDS and had beat her. On the stand, though, Judy Butler admitted those claims were completely false, concocted solely because Dee Dee pressured her into saying these things. Polk County Deputy David Clark testified that during the initial missing person investigation, he warned Dee Dee about lying. And according to David Clark, Dee Dee sexually propositioned him, and she later offered to rent a hotel room to perform sex acts to derail the investigation, which he flatly rejected. Again, Dee Dee is a real piece of work. It was later established that Abraham had been shot, 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, and the gun used was the one that Dee Dee had. And that gun she had handed over to the undercover officer. The defense argued that the state's case was entirely circumstantial. They asserted that while Dee Dee's gun may have been the murder weapon, ballistic testing was incomplete. The defense also claimed that detectives coerced her into talking by threatening to lock up her ex-husband for digging the hole. Dee Dee insisted through her lawyers that dangerous drug dealers were the ones who actually killed Shakespeare, and that she was only covering up because she feared for her family's safety. The defense team also noted that while Dee Dee was recorded detailing how to dispose of the body, she never explicitly stated on the tapes that she was the one who pulled the trigger. During the trial, Dee Dee created constant disruption in the courtroom. She frequently sobbed, put her head on the table, and shook. The judge threatened to throw her out of the courtroom after she was caught making exaggerated facial gestures to communicate with and try to manipulate jurors. She briefly halted proceedings by claiming she suffered anaphylactic shock and had to be hospitalized overnight. Even with the disruptions, the constant outbursts, the trial moved forward. After nearly 2 weeks of testimony and evidence, the case went to jury. Despite the defense's attempts to create reasonable doubt, jurors were ultimately unmoved by the theatrics and unconvinced by the alternate explanations that the defense team gave. In just over 3 hours, the jury found Dee Dee Moore guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Abraham Shakespeare. At sentencing, the judge made it clear how he viewed the crime. He described Dee Dee's conduct as cool, calculated, manipulated, and referred to Abraham as her prey and victim. The judge said money was the root of evil Dee Dee Moore brought into Abraham's life. He also described her as cruel, and Moore was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dee Dee has aggressively fought for a new trial ever since, flooding the Florida court systems with appeals. In her most recent courtroom bid, she attempted to blame Gregory Smith the prosecution's star informant witness for the murder. She now alleges that Smith was the true killer because Abraham was supposedly having an affair with Gregory Smith's wife. Her appeal suffered a major setback when her defense attorneys admitted that the mystery witness who allegedly could prove this claim had recently passed away. In a truly surreal twist of irony, while serving her life sentence, Dee Dee has publicly backed a Florida legislative bill aimed at shielding the identities of future lottery jackpot winners. She wrote letters stating that if Abraham's identity and massive winnings had been kept a secret from the public, predators would never have been able to target him, and he would still be alive today. Florida actually passed a law keeping the winners' names anonymous for 90 days. By the time Abraham's body was discovered in early 2010, virtually all of his physical liquid cash, the millions of dollars from the lottery, was entirely gone. The recovery and division of what remained of his estate became a complex multi-year legal battle fought by a court-appointed guardian on behalf of Abraham's two young sons. He had two sons, one named Moses and another one named Jeremiah. They both had different last names and different mothers. But anyway, because the physical cash was spent, Abraham's estate filed lawsuits seeking the return of items Dee Dee had purchased with Abraham's money. There were vehicles and assets purchased with the stolen cash. Those were seized by authorities and recovered through civil court orders to be liquidated for his two sons. When Abraham was alive, his single largest purchase was that $1 million mansion that he bought. And Dee Dee had fraudulently transferred the deed of his home into her own name, claiming she had bought it from Abraham. In October 2013, a Florida circuit judge officially stripped Dee Dee of the property and ordered it returned to Abraham's estate. The judge ruled that there was zero evidence she had ever paid Abraham a single dime for the home. The estate sold the mansion with 100% of the proceeds going into a trust fund for Abraham's sons. And we talked about Abraham's extreme generosity. He handed out millions of dollars to relatives to purchase homes and gave out just numerous personal loans. And the estate lawyer did not legally claw back the cash gifts for property Abraham had freely and legally given to family members. I think there was, I read somewhere where he had given his stepfather $1 million. But, however, Abraham had also acted as lender for several people, giving them mortgages to buy homes. And Dee Dee had fraudulently, again, transferred those mortgage rights to herself so she could collect the monthly payments like I mentioned earlier in the episode. In 2013, again, there was a court ruling that also stripped away these things from Dee Dee and transferred the mortgages back into Abraham's estate, allowing his two sons to collect those ongoing financial debts. And I do like that Abraham's sons have been able to recover at least some of the money stolen from their father. But here's the thing that is truly crazy and fun and interesting here. If we could take a break from, all the darkness that's in this episode, something kind of interesting happens here. In 2017, Antoinette Andrews, the former girlfriend of Abraham and the mother of his son, Moses, she purchases a $20 Monopoly scratch-off ticket at a Circle K gas station that's located in Lakeland, Florida. And she ends up winning $1 million. You know, Abraham wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't someone who spent his life chasing wealth or fame. He was a generous man who genuinely wanted to help the people around him. When he won the lottery, he did what many people hoped that they would do. He shared his good fortune with his friends, family members, and the people that he cared about. Unfortunately, a sudden fortune can attract more than friends. It can attract opportunists. In the years following his lottery win, Abraham found himself surrounded by lawsuits, requests for money, business schemes, and people promising to help him manage a life he never really asked for. What should have been a blessing slowly became a burden. In the end, the millions of dollars that made Abraham famous were never what defined him. What defined him were the people who loved him enough to keep asking questions when something didn't feel right. His mother knew that phone call wasn't from her son. His family refused to accept the answers that Dee Dee was giving them. Investigators kept pulling on threads that others might have ignored. And because they did, Abraham Shakespeare was eventually brought home and the person responsible was held accountable. This story still resonates because it forces us to ask a difficult question. What would we do if our lives changed overnight? What if we won the lottery? Would we recognize the people who genuinely cared about us? Would we recognize the people who only cared about what we had? For Abraham, that distinction ultimately became a matter of life and death. And that is what makes this story so unforgettable. And that is it for this episode of the Southern Blueprint Podcast. Thank you all so much for joining me. If you enjoyed today's show, I would greatly appreciate it if you would take a moment and to leave a rating and review wherever you're listening to your shows, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other platform. Those ratings and reviews really do help get this podcast out to new people. And again, like I said, if you want to support the podcast directly, consider joining the Hidden Pine Lodge over on Patreon. It's just $4 a month, and not only does it help support the work that goes into researching and producing these shows, but it also gives you access to our growing community of the Southern Blueprint. As members, you'll get access to our private Discord, where we discuss the podcast, and we discuss other things like history, folklore, travel, books, bourbon, the outdoors, gardening. Like I said, we have our book club, and we have our bird club. It's a great little thing that we have going on, and we hopefully will see you over there. Before we go, I'd like to give a special thank you to my producer, Corey Ensko, for his help behind the scenes on this episode, and for so many other things that he does. If I won the lottery, I would definitely give him some of my winnings. As always, thank you for taking the time to listen. Until next episode, take care of yourselves, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and I'll see you back here on the next episode of the Southern Blueprint Podcast.